want to start with the quote because I mentioned that you can argue with the title, and I think the title is actually more thought-provoking than the book itself, which is why lots of people are jumping at the opportunity to discuss the title. And one of those people is a very respected British diplomat. He's Sir Roderick Lyne. I haven't seen him here, but if he is here, he'll forgive me, I hope, because I want to quote from him. In the latest edition of Russia in Global Affairs, a specialist magazine, Sir Roderick writes, one British journalist, not known for his love for Russia, has brought out a book, The New Cold War and How to Win It. The cardinal features of the Cold War were ideological conflict, the perception of the direct military threat from the Soviet Union to the West and vice versa, proxy wars, the subjugation of the states of Central and Eastern Europe by the Warsaw Pact, and the isolation of the Soviet system from the capitalist world. Not one of these features exists today. Therefore, Sir Roderick argues, analogies with the Cold War do not stand up to any serious scrutiny and should be dismissed. Should they?
Well, thanks very much indeed for your very kind introduction and to the Frontline Club. We do have a couple of seats at the very, very front if anyone's standing at the back. I was quite impressed by Roderick Lyne's, I was going to say, not his grasp of detail, because the book actually isn't called The New Cold War and How to Win It. That was a very early title. But by the way in which he'd misunderstood what I'm saying, because for a start, this is not an anti-Russian book, and I'm not anti-Russian. And if I can just do a little test, I'm going to read out 8 names, and I want to see who can, and people who've heard this test before are not allowed to do it again. Hands up who knows who these people are. Tatiana Bayeva, Konstantin Babitsky, Larisa Bogoraz, Vadim Delaunay, Vladimir Dremluga, Viktor Feinberg, Natalia Gorbanevskaya, and Pavel Litvinov. Hands up, anyone who knows. Yes, very good. I see a couple of hands going up. Well, if I was talking about Germany, and I was to say who was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or Willy Brandt, or the Geschwister Scholl, or Count von Stauffenberg, there would be no hesitation in hands going up, because those would be the heroes of the German resistance to Nazism, and they're people of whom every modern German can be proud. And it would be absurd to write, if you wrote a book that was attacking the Nazis, or indeed the post-war legacy of Nazism and perhaps the lingering legacy of the SS, if it was arguable that was there in Germany. No one would say this was anti-German. And yet these 8 names ought to be the Russian counterparts of those German heroes. They're part of a tradition that starts with the Decembrists and goes on to through people like Akhmatova and Mandelstam and Gerson, who lived here in London, right up through Sakharov and up to the present day. And they are the 8 people who, with what would seem to us suicidal bravery, demonstrated in Red Square against the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia 40 years ago this year. They founded the modern human rights movement. And it's one of the things that I find most objectionable about the Chekist regime in Russia now, is that people like that have been written out of history. So this is not an anti-Russian book. Secondly, as I say, I think on page 3 of the book, if Sir Roderick had read that far, I'm not saying that the old Cold War is coming back. It's absolutely true. The old war was global, it was military, it was ideological. And what we've got now is quite different. There are a couple of similarities, that the main theatre of the new Cold War is Central and Eastern Europe, just as the main theatre of the old Cold War was Central and Eastern Europe. This is the area which is up for grabs, and there's a sharp, I mean, even people who are perhaps more moderate than me in their language will say there's a sharp strategic conflict going on in the Balkans, in the Baltics, and in Central Europe. I'm not saying that there's an ideological conflict, absolutely, in the sense of international communism versus capitalism, absolutely not. But I do think there is a conflict of values between the kind of what you might call authoritarian crony capitalism practiced in Russia and the kind of law-based multilateralism and rule-governed capitalism we have here. It's not a very sharp distinction, and sometimes our system is uncomfortably similar to the way things happen in Russia, and I go into that in the book and why we should mind about that, but I think there is a clash of values. But I think that the key thing about the new Cold War is it's about gas and the use of gas diplomacy, which is something the Soviet Union never did. The Soviet Union was a very reliable gas supplier, never played around with gas in the way that Russia now plays around with both gas and oil. And it's about the, which I think I describe in the book as perhaps dating from Vladimir Putin's understanding of judo, of using feint and bluff and gesture very effectively in diplomacy to get what Russia wants, particularly in terms of divide and rule. And I think we saw that really clearly at the NATO summit, which I've just been to in Bucharest. And that was a really classic tussle of the new Cold War, where you had Germany and France, particularly Germany, saying we have to take account of Russia's strategic interests, and basically overruling America. This was the first time, I think, in NATO's history that America didn't get something it wanted really badly, which was the membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine. And a kind of taboo was broken there, that Germany was able to stay, both Steinmeier and Merkel said, we have to take account of Russia's strategic interest, and that was, in effect, a kind of Russian veto in NATO's internal decision-making. Now, you can argue the merits of the case of whether Georgia and Ukraine should get MAP now or MAP later and so on, and I don't say that the answer on that is absolutely obvious or easy, but what I did find remarkable was the way in which Russia seemed to have an invisible seat at the table.
I'm glad you mentioned NATO, as they say, because my next quote, and this is the last quote in my bit, is also about NATO, and it's from Professor Robert Service, who wrote in The Observer this weekend. And he also says that the murmurings about the onset of a new Cold War will help nobody, and that NATO's eastward expansion is provoking Russian paranoia. But in your book, you write that the eastward expansion of NATO and Euro-Atlanticism has not been easy, but yet has been very positive. And you quote Poland as an example, you quote the Baltic states. So should Russian protestations be just dismissed?
Well, I think one has to distinguish between what one might call manufactured hysterics and real Russian fears. Now, if one was looking at the map, one would say there are two things that, and looking at the statistics, there are two things that Russia ought to be really scared of. And one's China, and the other's Muslims. And those are big threats for Russia. You have the most resource-rich part of Russia is the most thinly populated, and it's next to a very thickly populated part of China. And the Muslim birth rate in Russia is very high, and the Slav Russian birth rate is low, and Russia has very troubled relations both with the North Caucasus and potentially with Central Asia. And so it seems to me those are real fears. I think it's perfectly reasonable to talk to Russia more seriously about nukes, and in fact I do argue very strongly in the book that the American administration has been wrong to assume that dominance equals stability. It was crazy, I think, to rip up the ABM treaty and not press ahead with START 3, and both sides would be better off with deep cuts in their strategic nuclear arsenals, and it's quite reasonable, I think, for Russia to try and attract some attention on that. And I think it's also very reasonable that if Russia is the second biggest space power after the United States, to try and have some kind of international legal order in space. So on those things, I think Russia has a case. I don't think the case on NATO expansion stacks up. NATO is, the expansion of NATO to Poland, first of all to Central Europe and then to the Baltics and the Balkans, has always been accompanied by this kind of breast-beating hysterics in Russia about this is going to be an absolute disaster. But the effect has actually been very positive. This has calmed down these countries. Do you really think, if you remember what the Baltic states were like in the mid-1990s, with these excitable amateurish militias, with mutinies happening, with all sorts of dangers of provocation, and now you have small, well-disciplined militaries that are part of, heavily integrated into NATO, and it seems to me that must be good for Russia to have stable, democratic, well-governed neighbours, and the spread of the EU and NATO eastwards has created a zone of stability and security and prosperity, which one would think Russia would be pleased about, and it seems to me rather troubling that Russia gets on very well with countries when they're dictatorships, so it has excellent relations with Uzbekistan and Belarus, and yet finds it so difficult to get on with the democracies on its borders.
Dictatorships are more predictable, maybe, that's why. My question is about President Putin. You mentioned judo as one of his talents, but in your book you have a very interesting chart which shows his popularity, his rise from zero to hero, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
How did he do it?
Well, I think one point I make very strongly in the book is I'm not saying that the 1990s were a wonderful time for Russia, and then the ex-KGB came along and ruined it. And I think we simply can't understand what's happening now in Russia unless we take off our perhaps rather rose-tinted spectacles when we look at the 1990s. That I think that the way the Kremlin portrays the 1990s is a bit unfair, but for most Russians, this was a time of huge economic dislocation, collapse of industry, theft of national assets by oligarchs, the feeling the country was disintegrating, perhaps most of all the feeling of embarrassment, that the head of state was this embarrassing drunk who couldn't get off the plane to meet the Irish Prime Minister and seized the baton and tried to conduct a military band during a visit to Germany. And I think any country would find that was a rather a repellent period. And I think what Putin has done very successfully is to portray his rule and the rule of the ex-KGB people around him as not only a contrast but also an antidote to those 1990s. Now, the way it happened, I think, is quite troubling. And as I point out in the book, the apartment bombings of 1999, I think, are one of the big loose threads that, if they were tugged hard, a lot of this sort of image of Putin as the great leader would come undone. The other big thread which should be pulled hard is the corruption and the question of beneficial ownership. Who owns Gunvor? Who owns Skylink? Who owns Megafon? Who owns Surgutneftegas? The list continues. But corruption and the apartment block bombings in 1999, I think, are big loose threads. Now, what the apartment block bombings did was to take Russian public opinion and kind of crystallize it behind the feeling that the country was under attack by these apparently very well organized terrorists who were killing hundreds of Russians in their sleep. And therefore the answer was a very strong leader. Now, I think that was very cynical, and I look in some detail in the book at particularly the Ryazan bombing, where I just don't think that the official explanation makes sense. Why would two FSB officers steal a car, drive to Ryazan, and then buy sacks of sugar in the market, put real detonators and timers on them, and then put them in an unguarded basement in order to test security? That is the official version. I'm not making this up. That is
a defence exercise.
But whose vigilance are you trying to test? And added to all the other circumstantial evidence, so I'm afraid, I can't prove this, but I think the balance of evidence is that the authorities had a hand in the 1999 bombings, and that Mr. Putin was a beneficiary. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying he knew what was happening then, and that he was directly involved in ordering it. But I do find it very troubling, and I think that this manipulation of public opinion is one of the things that has helped him retain popularity all the way through.
But then you mentioned zero to hero, heroization of himself, of the KGB, of the Soviet past.
Yeah.
What role does it play in your view?
Well, I think that the KGB has, we in the West may not glamorize our intelligence services quite the way that to the extent that the KGB enjoys, at least in some quarters in Russia, the feeling, a good reputation. It's rather odd, perhaps, if you look at Russia and imagine that one was talking about Germany, post-Nazi Germany, that one wouldn't assume that the SS and the Gestapo would have a great reputation in a post-Nazi Germany. But for various reasons, the KGB had a reputation and as an aura of expertise and authority and competence in the Soviet Union, which to some extent has carried on afterwards, and particularly the Foreign Intelligence Service of the KGB, which Putin supposedly belonged to or was associated with, had perhaps an even more concentrated version of that. So he benefited a bit from that. But he's benefited from the manipulation of the media. Most Russians get their information from television, and the television is under Kremlin control and gives Putin an extremely easy ride. These carefully staged photo opportunities in the sort of action man, Superman sort of poses of fishing, piloting planes, stripped to the waist, on the judo mat, all this sort of thing. And an extraordinary reluctance to ask tough questions. And I think, it's one of the really striking things is the record of Putin over the last 8 years. And the government has actually been rather incompetent. They've had this bonanza of tens of billions of dollars coming in from the high oil and gas prices, which has sent living standards shooting up, and that's great, and obviously a great contrast to the 1990s. But where are the new roads? Even Mr. Medvedev's own think tank admits that the amount of paved roads in Russia has gone down since 2000. That's really striking. They say there are two big problems in Russia, fools and roads. well, I can't, we can't judge the fools, but on the roads, where are the new motorways?
That's global warming for you. That's the effect. Okay.
Yeah.
One other thing, as a result of these transformations, you argue that a new system has been created in Russia, something which is different from state capitalism, from Tsarism. What is it? Is it feudalism? Is it a different kind of arrangement that we haven't seen, unprecedented in history? How would you define it?
Well, I think it's hard to find a label that sticks. I mean, the Kremlin itself came up with the label of managed democracy, and then that was didn't prove not to be very long-lasting, and they tried sovereign democracy. And now Mr. Medvedev says he doesn't like sovereign democracy, and presumably there'll be another, maybe we'll have democracy with the Russian characteristics, just as China had socialism with Chinese characteristics. But I think, there are some clear elements to it. One is what you might call bread and circuses, of high living standards, and a feeling that prosperity is either just around the corner or maybe already here. The intense manipulation of the political system to a level that's really extraordinary. If Putin is really getting 80% popularity, and now Medvedev has 80% popularity, why are they so frightened of Mr. Kasyanov and Mr. Kasparov, who are really fringe political figures? Why are they so frightened of any independent voices in the Duma? So you get the political system being manipulated, the use of the media to manipulate public opinion, a hefty dose of what one might call nationalism, the use of authoritarian populist tools like the Nashi youth movement, which flowered and now seems to have shriveled, but may well come back again. But the short answer is I don't know. You could call it the Czechistocracy if you wanted, but because one defining characteristic of this is that most of the people in charge have a background in the organs of secret police power, either the KGB or the GRU. One could also say that it's something that fuses political and economic power in a way we haven't seen perhaps anywhere else. And I remember Boris Berezovsky sitting in your chair, or at least in your place, perhaps not that particular chair, a couple of years ago, and talking very eloquently about how the Kremlin had got this monstrous system which fused state power and commercial power, and how all the top people in the Kremlin had two business cards, one for their job at Rosneft or Gazprom or whatever, one for their job in the Kremlin, and how the use of secret police tools to keep this whole thing on the road. And it was all very eloquent. And then, to my great pleasure, a colleague of yours from the BBC got up and said, Boris Abramovich, you are absolutely right in your description of this system, but your criticism would be a lot more convincing if it didn't come from you, because this is a monster that you created. And I do think the roots of this kind of Czechistocracy monster lie in the Yeltsin era. That's when we first saw election rigging. That's when we first saw people like Korzhakov, Yeltsin's chief of bodyguards, bending the political system. And that's where we first saw people like Mr. Berezovsky, who in the mornings were running businesses, and in the afternoons were sitting in an office that directly led on to the Prime Minister's office.
One more question about winners and losers. One of the chapters in your book is entitled Winners and Losers of This Regime. The winners are sort of obvious. We know who they are, and you mentioned yourself the living standards, the average earnings are up, and the rest of it. Who are the losers in this setup?
Well, I think you have to look inside and outside Russia when you talk about the losers. And I think, inside Russia, the losers are really everybody who might have benefited from a real modernization of infrastructure and public services. That we've seen enormous debts being built up by Russian companies, corruption entrenched to a level that would have been unimaginable even in the Yeltsin era. And I suspect that people will look back on this period and say, where did all the money go? We had the 10 years of not just high but rising oil prices, and actually, we blew it. And so I think that, in one sense, the losers are all Russians. I think the ethnic minorities inside Russia are having a very tough time at the moment, and the sort of institutionalization of state racism is really worrying. I was absolutely horrified to see reports of a meeting of the Moscow police chief with representatives of all the ethnic minority communities in Russia, in Moscow, who'd gone to see him to talk about the wave of racist attacks. I think there was at one point there was a racist murder happening every day in Moscow, and his response was, well, why don't you make sure that your ethnic minority communities commit fewer crimes, and then there wouldn't be any reason to attack you. And that was, I mean, that was absolutely sort of astonishingly sort of a bad response. But I think that the losers right now are the countries outside Russia, because we are losing, and we're seeing the Finlandization of Western Europe and the re-establishment of a kind of political and economic dominance of Russia in Eastern Europe, and that's really worrying. And if you look at what's happened in just in the months of this year with the South Stream pipeline, where we've seen Serbia, which admittedly has no reason to love the West right now, but also Bulgaria and Hungary, just falling into the Russian camp on South Stream, that is a loss to all of Europe. We are losing our energy security as we speak.
We'll come back to Nord Stream and South Stream a little bit later, but first you mentioned the influence and power, and one of the phrases you use in your book is banks are not tanks as the method of influence.
Yeah.
And I remember one colleague of mine who was working in Moscow during the Yukos affair told me that one of the most shocking things in Russia during the imprisonment of Mr. Khodorkovsky was absolute lack of solidarity by Western bankers and Western business people in Moscow with somebody with whom they wined and dined just a day before the verdict was announced. And you have very, very harsh words directed against Western bankers, British tycoons, as you described, saying they have no shame in chasing their wallet. And basically, I understand that in your description, they're the fifth column. They are the fellow travelers who are now reining in any criticism of Russia. This is not the story you will hear from them. Their argument is that Russia is not Burma. So what's wrong with making money in Russia?
Well, I think I'm not against at all, excuse me, people making money in Russia. I think our best hope is to integrate Russia into the kind of the greater West, and the more real Russian companies with real cost and real customers and real competition and real shareholders get involved in the Western economic system, the better. That's in the end, I think it's good. I'm certainly not calling for kind of sanctions or blockade. But what does trouble me a lot is the way in which Westerners, the sniff of a few million rubles, Westerners seem to forget everything that they've been that they should presumably been brought up with. And I give the example of PricewaterhouseCoopers in the book, and I'd love it if there was someone from PricewaterhouseCoopers here who'd like to respond to this. But PricewaterhouseCoopers was the auditor for UKOS, and it was a very interesting sequence of events. That first of all, UKOS used to be a really bad company, and it's difficult to discuss UKOS in the 1990s in great detail because of the laws of libel. And you'll notice in my book I regularly have phrases like vehemently denies all wrongdoing and strenuously protests his innocence, and I'd like to suggest that in some, but perhaps not all cases, you replace that with has no convincing explanation for his conduct, because that's perhaps
that's an off-the-record comment.
Well, I mean I can't be more specific, but the British libel laws are very tough, and a lot of places in the book I haven't been able to say what I wanted to say about Western companies because of libel. But the sequence of events with UKOS is really interesting. You have this company which I think we said in The Economist that Mr. Khodorkovsky's path to power and riches was littered with the corpses of his rivals. So I guess if we said that in The Economist, I can say it again. I'm just quoting The Economist. And Pricewaterhouse decided it was okay to take on UKOS as a client in the 1990s. Now, maybe that was the right thing to do, because it did turn out that UKOS was trying to clean itself up. And we saw during the late night from 1998 onwards to about 2002, UKOS really did begin to get its act together. And they, both on a technical front, they brought in lots of expert foreign managers, and on a financial front, they produced increasingly clear accounts. The share price went rocketing up, and in a way that was the best expression of outsiders' trust. And so if people had ignored my advice in 1998 when I was being beastly about UKOS and bought UKOS shares and sold them in 2002 when I left Moscow, I think they would have made a 16-fold profit. So don't read The Economist for investment advice. But what happened then was really interesting, because you could argue at that point that PricewaterhouseCoopers had done the right thing. They'd helped with the clean-up. And then UKOS came under attack with this extraordinary bombardment of spurious legal and tax challenges, which I think exemplified the way that the Kremlin uses all the organs of state power against its opponents. And what did PricewaterhouseCoopers do? First of all, they said, we stand by our audit. And then they got raided. they were in danger of losing their license in Russia, and they were in danger of losing all their clients. Now, you can imagine, perhaps in a parallel universe, that you might have some accountants who would say, actually, our professional reputation matters more to us than a few clients here or there, or even our presence in a country here or there, because ultimately we want people to think that we really stand for the principles of honest accounting. And when we've signed off on some accounts, we stand by that. We are the licensed gatekeepers of capitalism, and we can't just back away from it. Well, it would be nice to think that, but it wasn't what happened. And what PricewaterhouseCoopers actually did was they bravely withdrew their audit from UKOS from the years in question and produced, and I quote this in the book, a remarkable thing, saying it's come to our notice that UKOS is relying on our audit for its legal defence, and we are therefore left with no option to withdraw it. So much for Western values. And I found that really shocking.
Did they rewrite it? Did they change the figures?
No, they just withdrew the audit. And of course that helped the Kremlin in its case that, because UKOS was arguing that it had been clean in these years, the Kremlin was arguing that it had been crooked, and without the defence of the audit, I have no idea, maybe the audit was spurious, maybe PricewaterhouseCoopers had shut their eyes to some very crooked stuff, and they were now afraid of being found out. In that case, that was bad for another reason. But either way, it's really hard to find, these boring accountants who we all depend on, whenever you buy shares, you're basically buying the word of the accountant that this company is what it says it is. And now, I don't know how are we to believe anything any Western accountant says about a Russian company.
I don't know. Don't ask me. A couple of questions from me, and then we'll open it up for the audience for questions from the floor. One is about South Stream and North Stream. In your book, I think there's a very interesting analysis, economic analysis of both pipelines. One is the longest underwater pipeline, which is 25%, I think, above the similar pipeline built on land. The other is the deepest underwater pipeline when it's going to be built. Economically, they don't make sense, but politically, Russia argues it doesn't want intermediaries like Ukraine. This is about energy security. Russia wants to deliver directly, and Russia wants to control the whole chain. Production, transportation, delivery, downstream assets, selling to the public. What's wrong with that argument?
Well, I think you have to look at gas as partly as a business and partly as politics. And the funny thing about gas is once you build a pipeline, it's very difficult to make a business case for building a second one. So pipelines tend to create monopoly. It's not quite the same with oil, because if I have a pipeline to you with oil and I cut the oil off, you can go down to the oil market and buy a tanker of oil and substitute for my pipeline. And Lithuania is indeed doing exactly that. Russia cut off the pipeline to Lithuania, and Lithuania is now importing oil, I think, from Venezuela, and bringing it into the Lithuanian refinery and refining it there and then selling the products on. It costs quite a lot of money, but it's doable. With gas, you can't do that. It's really difficult and expensive to ship gas around by tank.
You can do liquefied, like
you can liquefy, but then you have the problem, liquefied gas transport is really expensive. You've got to compress the gas, you've got to transport it in these enormous sort of bottles, and then you've got to liquefy it at the other end. And it's quite difficult to be price competitive with gas unless you have some, you rig the market to allow it. So I think that what we need to do in the European Union is to diversify our supply and demonopolise gas imports. And it seems to be extraordinary that we say to Microsoft, and actually there is an alternative to Microsoft. You can go to Apple, you can go to Linux, but we say to Microsoft, your Windows software is a monopoly and that's no good, and we're going to force you to unbundle and so on. Why can't we do the same to Gazprom? We should give the Russians the compliment of treating their biggest company in the same way as we treat America's biggest company, and saying Russia actually needs Europe more than Europe needs Russia. Europe is 3 times bigger than Russia in population terms and 12 times bigger in economic terms. The EU GDP is 12 trillion, Russia is 1 trillion. So actually the Russians should really be coming to us and saying, can we sell you some gas? And we should be saying, well, we've got a good offer from Norway, we've got a good offer from Algeria, we've got this liquefied stuff coming in from Trinidad and wherever, so, let's see. We ought to be in a stronger bargaining position. And it's a sign of how feeble European policy has been that we get these extraordinary bilateral gas deals happening with countries like Germany and with the South Stream pipeline and the countries involved like that. So we end up with the Gazprom tail wagging the European dog. And it's one of the big messages in my book is we ought to try and turn that round.
The interesting thing is that it appears for South Stream, Russia needs permission from Ukraine and Romania to run it past their territory.
Yeah.
Maybe that could be an interesting stumbling block. Today is an important day for discussing Russia and discussing Putin, I think, because exactly a month from now, President Putin will be elected chairman of the United Russia Party, will become the prime minister, and the next day on May the 9th, together with the incumbent president, not incumbent, the president-elect, Mr. Medvedev, they will probably come out together to the Lenin Mausoleum and watch the parade with the biggest display of weapons, tanks, missiles, maybe something that wasn't shown for a long time. In your book, you argue that this should be resisted, but how can you resist this kind of influx, this kind of robustness that is emanating from the Kremlin when Russia is part of the G8? When, as you mentioned, Germany is a friend of Russia, but there are other friends as well. And it's a very awkward arrangement. What are the ways of actually winning the Cold War?
Well, I think, first of all, I wouldn't worry too much about the military parades. I think this is the least worrying thing. I worry about Russian arms sales. I worry about them selling the Shkval to Iran or to the Mosquito missile to China. But if you remember those military manoeuvres, the naval manoeuvres off the Bay of Biscay a few months back, which got great headlines in the British press, and it looked tremendously impressive when you saw the Admiral Kuznetsov with the planes taking off and landing and this great flotilla of sort of 20 big Russian ships. It was a bit less impressive when you remember that wasn't a flotilla of the Russian Navy, that was the Russian Navy. It's one of the signs of the incredible corruption in Russia that despite the extraordinary increases in the defense budget, they're finding it really, really difficult to modernize. They still haven't got the Pskov division properly operational. They're trying to buy helicopters for it, and they can't find the new helicopters for the Pskov division. Now, if you're an Estonian, you might wonder why the Pskov division, which is right next to you, needs attack helicopters. That's another question. But the good news is they're finding it very difficult to make the military-industrial complex work properly. So I'm not that worried about military for now. I think what we need to do is, as I said earlier, we need to engage Russia on things that matter. So engage on nukes, space, Afghanistan maybe, global warming, all these big country issues. We have to talk to...
When you say engage, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, if it's in case of America, we need to negotiate START 3. That's very... we can continue talking about missile defense, although I wouldn't give them a veto on what we're doing in Europe. But I think that they have every reason to be worried about a mad regime in Iran with intermediate nuclear missiles, because they'll hit Russia before they'll hit hit Europe or the United States. So I think I'm all in favour of talking to Russia. I wouldn't do it through the G8. I'd have a G14 and have big countries, have India and China, Brazil and 3 or 4 others in there. And then I'd have a smaller meeting of countries that are democratic, where you might want to include India, but I don't see you could possibly include Russia if you have rigged elections, psychiatric incarceration of dissidents, state control of the media, etc., 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 all things I outline in the book. That seems to me impossible to be part of a sort of narrowly defined democratic club. I'm also arguing we should suspend Russia from the Council of Europe, because I think the Council of Europe is an important symbolic body, and it seems to be atrocious that we suspended Belarus 10 years ago from the Council of Europe on what now seems like a technicality, and we're allowing these, the dreadful abuses of human rights that are happening in Russia, and still allowing Russia to sit there, and indeed very nearly had an ex-KGB guy, Mikhail Margelov, very nearly became president of the Council of Europe, thanks to the sort of insane behaviour of the British Tories.
So this withdrawal from the Council of Europe, it's one of the mechanisms where Russians can at least redress some of the grievances they have. Talking about European Court of Human Rights, for instance, some of the cases brought over the abuses in Chechnya, in other areas in Northern Caucasus. If Russia is suspended or is kicked out in some way from the Council of Europe, what are the mechanisms? What are the international tools that remain?
I think that's a serious point, and we lose, if Russia is suspended, we lose some of that. But it doesn't seem to be anything that's holding the Kremlin back very much. And in fact, the latest news I've read from the Kremlin is that they want to make it more difficult for Russian citizens to go to the European Court of Human Rights anyway. And it doesn't seem to me that it has a huge effect on what happens in Russia. Russia tends to, it fights the case, loses, pays compensation, and life carries on pretty much as before. But I think that the symbolic price of allowing Russia to sit in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe as if it was just another democratic country, I think is too high. But I think the most important thing is that we need to get our act together in terms of the way our own system works. Now, we have done this on money laundering. 30 years ago, if you'd said we had to try and stop people paying money into banks without explaining who they were, people have said that's impossible. You can't stand between banks and their money any more than you can stand between pigs in the trough. And because we were worried about money laundering, we did that. And even in Austria now, you cannot turn up at a bank with a suitcase full of €1,000 notes and say, never mind where I got it, I want to pay this in and make some transfers. You can't do that anymore. And that's been done through the Financial Action Task Force, with help of the OECD and so on. So we can do it with money. I think we should do it with assets as well. If I turned up in the City of London with a suitcase full of stolen Fabergé eggs or some Kandinsky canvases that I'd swiped from an art gallery in Moscow and said, now, a bit of a legal wrangle about this, but anyway, they're mine, I need a bank to sell them, I need a law firm to make it look legal, a PR firm to make it look good. I think even now in the City of London somebody might call security. If you turn up with a stolen oil company, an oil company whose main assets are the stolen remains of a company that's been looted by the Kremlin or by the ex-KGB people who run the Kremlin, and you have people queuing up to do the IPO, and you have law firms queuing up, and you have PR firms queuing up. And the worst thing is you get this race to the bottom where companies that are not respectable enough to list on the New York Stock Exchange then find the London Stock Exchange comes and say, well, we're a bit more flexible, so please list here. And if they stink too much even for London, then you find some of the continental ones going. So I think we need to establish a kind of floor in our, and a floor not an F-L-A-W, an F-L-O-O-R in our financial system, and say there are some things you can't do. And it should be absolutely impossible, for example, for a respectable Austrian bank to conceal the beneficial ownership of Rosuk Energo. Rosuk Energo is a company that, I have to be careful because of libel here, is a company that apparently exists to siphon off financial flows from the consumers of Ukraine, the shareholders of Gazprom, the taxpayers and citizens of Russia, and to some extent from the people who own Turkmenistan. And this company has gone from 0 to 4 billion in the space of a couple of years. Its accounts are on the web. You can look at it. Who owns it? We don't know. Why don't we know? Because Raiffeisen Bank, one of the most supposedly respectable Austrian banks, conceals the identity. And guess who audits the accounts of Rosuk Energo? I'll give you a clue. It's 3 letters and it starts with P.
Fabergé. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your chance now to ask questions. We covered a wide range of topics. Please probe as robustly as you can. This is your chance. Please, if you could identify yourself, name, perhaps organization.
Questions from the Russian Embassy and PricewaterhouseCoopers will be particularly welcome.
Yes, please, lady here.
Not from the Russian Embassy. Olesya Khromychuk. Just concentrating on the title for the moment, since I haven't read any other part of the book yet. You seem to be suggesting quite boldly that it's a new Cold War period now, and going back to the argument of Robert Service already mentioned today, he says that using that term underestimates the seriousness of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So what should be the relationship between the countries for them to be bad enough to be Cold War, or at least Cold War? And my second question is, what do you think is the role of Georgia and Ukraine in this war?
Let me answer the second question first. I think I'm afraid your role is to be the front line. And I guess you must be. Are you from Ukraine?
I am.
Yeah. No, I mean, Ukraine, if the worst news for the Kremlin would be a big success in Ukraine. If Ukraine becomes a stable, democratic, prosperous country over the long term, then the Kremlin plans are basically done for. If they manage to re-establish the sort of control in Ukraine that they have in Belarus, then I think we're done for. So Ukraine is really important. Georgia is also really important because it's the transit country for the Caspian. And if we lose Georgia, we lose any chance of getting Caspian and Central Asian gas to Europe independently of Russia. So, I mean, I think you are, those two countries and the Baltics, I think, are absolutely the front line at the moment. And the New Cold War is a very stark title, but in the end I had a choice between really grabbing people's attention or going for something that was sort of very nuanced and accurate. And I thought that, I thought of calling it the Cold Peace, but Janusz Bugajski has already written a very good book called The Cold Peace. But I think there is a really sharp tussle here. We've seen, bombs are going off in Georgia. We've seen 2 missile attacks in Georgia. We've seen people killed. We see really fierce tussles for the control of crucial political and economic assets. And you know, the deeper you get into this, the more you see it's a really hard head-to-head fight all over Eastern Europe and actually here as well. A lot of it's hidden, but it's still there. And so in the end I decided that you know, a bold, stark title was better, because I do want to wake people up. I don't want people to think that this is just some kind of mild continuation of some kind of little rows we had in the 1990s. This is something that's really different. You know, Russia is run by people who don't like us. Russia is run by people who want to divide and rule. You know, people who actually you think that Finlandization was great, and they would like to Finlandize Western Europe, and they bitterly resent the loss of Eastern Europe, and they'd like it back. Yeah, and they pretty much say that. They pretty much say that. You know, they want to end the Atlantic Alliance. Putin himself said the Atlantic Alliance was foolishness. Well, I think the Atlantic Alliance was rather a good thing, because it helped win the last Cold War, and I'd quite like to see it survive. So I'm banging the bell pretty hard here, but I think it's because there's reason to be alarmed.
It's the title that many people think about, but very few perhaps are prepared to say it.
Yeah.
The gentleman there, and then the lady. Over here, please. No, oh, they're just behind you, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm from Georgia. I'm a student at UCL. I'm really curious, how is selling of your book going in Germany? Because most Germans, I might think that you are crazy. It's actually striking what you said, that how success and reform is understood as a threat in Russia. And in Georgia's case, what actually Russians do say in open discourse, it is that success in Georgia, democracy in Georgia, is potentially destabilizing for Northern Caucasus, which is totally bizarre. Your prediction a month ago, or 2 months ago, that you were saying that Russia will effectively gain veto power that you just admitted over NATO's internal decision-making came true. What I heard recently is that Germany and France have been tacitly encouraging Greece to keep vetoing in this totally bizarre action Macedonia's entry, so that under this smoke they are able to pull out much more important decisions, which is Georgia and Ukraine. Do you think that is insane idea?
I hope you're using very, very reliable sources of the German Foreign Ministry.
These are sources in Brussels.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I do find, there's lots of good questions there. I do find the Greek stance on Macedonia's name incomprehensible, because Macedonia is now offering a solution which previous Greek governments have demanded, and Macedonia refused to give, and now Macedonia is giving it, and this Greek government says it's unacceptable. Is there a hidden agenda there? I don't know, but certainly the facts would fit the theory that you have. Yes, I'm afraid I was proved right on this veto on alliance decision making, and you know, I think that's troubling. I wouldn't quite agree with you on Germany, that actually, I mean, the German press is becoming very critical of the, there's been very strong articles in the Süddeutsche, in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, in Kapital magazine, Ostsee-Zeitung, I mean, you know, mainstream German media is criticizing this kind of Merkel, what's now, I'm afraid, a kind of Merkel-Steinmeier alliance, quite strongly. And I think and the Greens, particularly the sort of the hawkish wing of the Greens, have latched onto this and are making this quite, making Putin bashing part of their, a central feature of their, of their political stance. Now, I think all over Western Europe, and Eastern Europe too, but all over Western Europe, the public is a bit wiser than the governing elites. And so you see governments that tend to be rather dozy and dopey and perhaps even corrupt in their dealings with the Kremlin. But I think that public opinion is quite spooked by what's going on, and there's a bit of pressure from that end. Though the German translation seems to be selling very well.
And the latest name is probably Upper Macedonia, to which the Greeks will agree. We don't know. The lady there, and then there's a gentleman there. Yeah.
Hi, Anna Kogan. I've got two questions. Number one, you said that the real threats would be more. Sort of a bit of a professional interest. The BBC World Service, Russian service, is either blocked or hardly available in Russia. But the thing is, people are not actually very interested in it. So is there anything that we can do?
In the blog of the Russian service?
No,
The world service.
Listenership is low. There's one seat here at the front if someone is tired of standing.
Okay.
Possibly. Yeah.
Shall we?
Yeah.
Go
Well,
to
I think yeah. I think the days of shortwave radio broadcasting sadly are over, except for people like me, perhaps, who have a sentimental attachment to it. And I don't think that there's very. I mean, I think it's symbolically interesting that the Russian authorities have closed down the the FM frequencies for the BBC. Again, it's not because Russians are tuning in their millions to listen to these broadcasts, but it's a sign of what one might call sort of general control freakery or xenophobia, in a way of sort of supposedly getting back at Britain, which we can go into separately. I think the question why I love your phrase of canoodling with Iran. That's very good. You may see that appear in The Economist before long. But I think the reason why they make a fuss about Central Europe is because it works. By kicking up this huge, extraordinary rhetoric. I think Putin said to Bush, "Ukraine isn't a proper country." Certainly, that's well, Russian press quoted that from the Bush-Putin meeting. But Titov saying that Central Europe is Russia's, who was deputy Russian foreign minister, saying Central Europe is a historic sphere of influence for Russia. And so we have legitimate interests there. This venomous, continuing attack on the Baltic states, which just goes on and on and on, in defiance of all facts and logic. And I think they see this as a way of dividing Europe, and it's a way of making the Germans think, and the French and the Dutch and other West European countries think, oh, these East Europeans are nothing but trouble, and thinking maybe Russia's got a point. So then the next thing that happens is that the East Europeans get lent on by the West Europeans not to kick up a fuss. And so when Lithuania quite reasonably wants to block the partnership and cooperation agreement for the EU because they're being so badly treated by the Kremlin, and then the Germans come along and arm twist them and say, please be reasonable. I don't quite see the rest of Europe arm twisting the Germans and saying, please be reasonable about Nord Stream. It seems to be a source for the goose is not source for the gander. But this rhetorical and, to some extent, economic pressure on Central Europe brings results. And it also does another thing, which is it encourages countries to switch sides. And so you get a country like Bulgaria or Hungary, which is seeing the benefits, at least in the short term, of playing the Kremlin tune. And of course that then weakens the stance of the others. So in the Balkans, for example, Romania, which is the only country still standing up strongly for Nabucco, is looking pretty isolated. What's the benefit for Romania with these paying very high gas prices in sticking up for Western energy security when all the countries around it are jumping in with Russia on South Stream and going to get lower gas prices?
Just to clarify the position on the Russian service, since you mentioned it, what's happening is we have very, very big difficulties in reaching Russian audiences now. We've lost a number of partners, FM partners. We bid some time ago for a frequency. We wanted to play by the book, but as one of my colleagues says, in Russia it's sometimes not legal enough. It's never legal enough. We basically won the right to do a FM broadcasting together with one Russian station and one other commercial partner. But then the station was purchased by a financial group which is now broadcasting nothing. But basically we were kicked out of that frequency. So there are only medium waves that we have, and short wave is on the way out. Not only in Russia but throughout the world. But our online figures on the Russian side are quite impressive. 1.5 million, 2 million page impressions. We have hundreds of thousands of visitors. So this is probably the area where the Russian service will expand and has a chance of expanding. But it's the general attitude towards Western media as such. Not only us who are suffering. Radio Liberty is suffering, Deutsche Welle is suffering, Voice of America is suffering.
So even Deutsche Welle, despite the
television presence, or Mrs. Merkel.
Despite Miss Merkel,
would you listen to Deutsche Welle because of Mrs. Merkel?
No, but I'm interested that the Kremlin would try and stop Deutsche Welle.
Yeah, no, it's just the general attitude towards Western media and presence on the Russian market. And as soon as when we were on FM in Moscow, we were reaching figures of 2 million weekly audience. And as soon as we became prominent in the top 20 stations in Russia because of the audience, there was great concern and people were advised that maybe it's better not to
Would somebody
broadcast it. But I mean, let's concentrate on the book and Lucas.
Would someone
I
like to
think
ask
there
a
was
hostile question?
So there's a question there, and there's a question there, please. Yes. The gentleman in spectacles. Yes, please. Yeah.
My question isn't hostile, I'm afraid, but I'm going to put it to you that we partly won the last Cold War because the people of Eastern Europe wanted our way of life and, you know, came across the wall. But the problem with Russia is that the majority of the people clearly don't. They're clearly happy with the state of affairs. They don't want to listen to the BBC World Service. They are very proud of Russia, and to most people seem to have tapped into this great seam of nationalism and are very voting for Putin and Medvedev in their droves.
Should we take 2 or 3 questions together, maybe? And
Okay, there's a gentleman there, and then there's a lady. I think, is it a lady? I can't see. No, that's another gentleman. So the gentleman there in blue shirt, please. And then there's a gentleman in spectacles in the back. Yes, there are 2 questions from here. Okay. Yes, please. The gentleman in the blue shirt there.
Thank you. Hello. I recently read an article by a guy called Richard Sakwa, who basically argued that Russia under Vladimir Putin has made a sustained effort to cooperate with the West, with Europe and the US. That Russia sees itself firmly as part of Europe and not as an alternative to it. But Western powers were not prepared to accept post-Cold War Russia into the international community on equal terms. Because of this mutual lack of understanding, such coming together has been frustrated. And so today you've got a resurgent Russia which is at risk of becoming a rival rather than a partner. Do you agree with any of his arguments? And is it too late for Western leaders to accept that Russia can be a partner, but on equal terms?
Since there was a cluster of questions within that question, perhaps
well,
you
I
could
think I
these
could
two
confidently
together.
say that I disagree with Richard Sakwa about absolutely everything. So the answer, I mean, I just don't share his reading of the 1990s, and I think that we actually tried quite hard to integrate Russia into what one might call the Greater West, and bringing Russia into the Council of Europe was one thing, bringing it into the G8 was another. The NATO-Russia Council was a third, and the institutional mechanisms are there for cooperation if the willingness is there to take them up. I think the problem was that even under Yeltsin, the people who were running Russian foreign policy, particularly from the Primakov onwards, still saw foreign relations very much in a zero-sum game. So if something was good for the West, they thought it must be bad for Russia. And so it was very, I mean, there were occasional episodes of cooperation. I think Chernomyrdin going to Serbia to tell Milosevic it was time to stand down was one. I think the post-September 11th was another. But it's very odd the way that's what the Russians then say is, we helped you in Afghanistan, and what did we get out of it? To which I'd say, well, actually, the Northern Alliance, we helped your proxies in Afghanistan, which was the Northern Alliance, who you'd been supporting for 10 years rather unsuccessfully, and we then gave them huge amounts of money and weapons and air support and all the rest of it, and got rid of the Taliban, who was supporting the Chechens and causing you a lot of problem. That would be, I mean, with all deference to the Chechens, and it's not quite like that. But that's an argument we could have and did make to the Russians. So I just don't agree that. I mean, I think Russia feels sometimes isolated, even when no isolation has taken place. I think more often there's this myth, which is that Russia is a besieged fortress surrounded by malevolent hypocrites, which is a really convenient myth for the Kremlin to propagate. And I'm afraid it's sometimes taken up by people in the West. On the first question, I absolutely agree. I think we won the Cold War last time round, partly because of the Soviet economic and political collapse, partly because of our arms spending just outstripping them, but perhaps most of all because of our moral authority. Our system worked better, and in the end, most people behind the Iron Curtain wanted to live like we did, whereas very few of us wanted to live like they did. And one of the points I make in the book, and I should point out, by the way, this is the 3rd edition here, so it's got a lot of the mistakes in the 1st edition have been removed. So it's also £2 off here, so a very good price. And I will inscribe it in either Russian or English, as you like. But one of the points I make is that we need to get back that kind of moral authority that we had. And our system doesn't look that great now. And a lot of Russians look at the West and say, yeah, Western values, Schroeder, Berlusconi, PricewaterhouseCoopers, you know, what exactly is it here that we're meant to emulate? And I think that, you know, and we don't have an easy answer to that. I mean, you know, we can say, actually, the American presidential election, for all America's faults, is a little bit different from the Russian presidential election. You know, the Russian presidential election is worthy of Bulgakov. It was completely mystifying and completely predictable. We had no idea. We knew exactly who was going to win and had no idea what it meant. And we still don't really know what Mr. Medvedev. Whereas in America, it's the other way around. The positions of the candidates are very clear. We still don't know who the candidate's going to be, let alone who's going to win. So, you know, we can say our political system is a bit more open and therefore more admirable. But we do need to get back. We need to get our act together here. And I mentioned some of the things we need to do in our book. Because I think, you know, what we've got at the moment in Russia is a mixture of red, brown and white. Red for Soviet nostalgia, brown for what one might call fascism, and white for what one might call Tsarist nostalgia. And that's a pretty potent mixture. And there's this kind of comforting myth we have that the future's orange. Orange as in Ukraine. In the end, it's going to go democratic. It's just a matter of time. Well, I'm not sure it is. I think the future may be black just as much as it may be orange. And so when Putinism hits the buffers, as it will, you know, I would like our system to be so obviously to be working well, to the point that Russians would then think, yes, you know, we should try and be a bit more like that, rather than thinking, well, we've tried, you know, the Western way and it simply didn't work, and now let's try something else.
There are two hands on this side, the gentleman there, and I think, yes, the gentleman there, yes, and one question from here. So shall we do two here, and then...
Thanks. I'm Andrew Colhoun, I work for a credit rating agency. You argue that gas is viewed by the Kremlin not just as a business, but as politics, and it seems to me that that's one of the main planks of your argument, that there is a new Cold War happening, and that gas is used as a kind of weapon in a geostrategic competition with the West. I'd be interested to know how you reconcile that with, I think, the argument that's in your book that Gazprom, the main gas company, is appallingly badly managed. I mean, if you have a weapon, you would think that you would sort of polish it or keep it clean, or at least keep it usable. Whereas Gazprom is virtually, well, because of its chronic underinvestment in capacity and exploration, is running short of the gas it needs to supply its domestic customers, let alone customers in the West.
Thank you. And there's a lady there in the row, and then the gentleman there.
Thank you. Helen Samueli from Center for Research into Post-Communist Economies. It's not a hostile question, but it's a tiny bit critical, if I may. Very, very small. Your argument is that the European Union should really get together, get its act together, speak with one voice, and then we can stand up to Russia. In actual fact, on past experience, one would say that that one voice would be saying, let's give in to Russia, as Germany is doing in effect, shut up to the Poles, the Balts, and everyone else. And it is, in fact, the reason the Europeans haven't quite given in is because these uppity Balts and East Europeans have not allowed the European Union to speak with one voice. So that's my tiny criticism.
Okay, so we have Gazprom, European Union, a gentleman there, and we'll take one more question. Will you manage four in a row? Okay.
You've made a passing reference tonight and in print too to the Tory flabbiness perhaps over Russia. I wonder if you have any further comment, considering they may be the next government.
Yeah, thank you. And one more question from the gentleman there.
Alistair Macaulay from the University of Essex. I want to go back to the internal weaknesses or possible weaknesses of the Putin system. And you talked about bread and circuses. And yes, it certainly is true that in certain parts, particularly in Moscow, that we see enormously rapid increases in the standard of living. But there's an awful lot of Russia where that nothing is happening, where there is still deep poverty, there is stagnation. This is in small towns and even in some quite big towns, like Ivanovo-Voznesensk, where nothing is happening and that the people have not seen any of the benefits of Putin's dash for growth, and maybe there will be opposition, maybe not very pleasant opposition, but opposition from internally against the Putin regime.
Right, thank you. Well, let me take those in reverse order. I would absolutely agree, it's islands of wealth in the sea of poverty. and it's astonishing how little trickle-down there's been on public services and infrastructure, which I think are what really matters. But I do think living standard, in terms of cash in pocket, your wages have gone up, benefits are paid on time. If you ask, even in poor parts of Russia, if you ask Russians, do you live better now than you did in the 1990s, the answer is yes, and that's a kind of basic thing. But I do think the emperor has no clothes, and I'm just longing for the day when you turn on Russian telly, which I get in my office, and I see Swan Lake playing, and then the news comes on, and a solemn-faced announcer says the prosecutors have raided the dacha of former Prime Minister Putin, who just resigned a few hours earlier on grounds of ill health, and discovered documents showing that billions of dollars have been diverted to this company called Gunvor. And it could all change, and then you'd get a tidal wave of analysis about how badly all the money had been spent. I mean, things could change very quickly. It is brittle. I think on the Tories, the thing that bothers me is let's take a very simple sequence of argument that I think that really, it deserves endless repetition for Tories. What is the biggest security threat to Britain? Energy. Okay. The really big danger is not, from Russia, is not that we're going to be attacked by Russian submarines or something. The energy security is a really big threat, perhaps even the number one. Can we deal with it on our own? No. Okay. What possible organisation is there to deal with energy security on a collective basis? Well, NATO or the EU. Can't be NATO. NATO is not set up to be an energy security organisation, so it can only be the EU. To bargain more effectively with Russia on energy, does the EU need to be stronger or weaker? Stronger. Okay. Now, you're already on very dangerous territory for a lot of Tories there, and they find, I find that quite a compelling sequence. If we turn monopoly, so I'm using my sort of geeky economist phrasebook here, if we turn monopoly into monopsony, we're in a very strong position. They can't turn around to the Chinese overnight and say, we've been screwing around with the Europeans for too long, now we'd like to screw around with you, so can we sell gas to you instead? They actually need us as customers, they need our capital, they need our expertise. They can't develop the Stockman field without us. So therefore, we are actually in a strong position. We do need to act together. Now, I disagree a little bit with Helen on the case of... I don't think the EU pulls security down to the lowest common denominator. Let me give you an example why. When Estonia joined Schengen, which is the single passport area, which we are not part of, but the Estonians and most of the post-communist members of the EU are, when you join Schengen, you add your blacklist to the Schengen blacklist. And mostly it's people who've kind of stolen cars or, traffic pornography or whatever. But Estonia did a really clever thing. They put the leaders of Nashi on their Schengen blacklist. And suddenly this golden youth, the most privileged young people in Russia, suddenly found they couldn't get a visa for any Schengen country. That was an example of European soft power really working. And they were furious about this. And there was an immediate protest, and this wasn't publicised, I just heard about it. There was an immediate protest from the Russians to the Germans, and they said, you can't let this pipsqueak little country Estonia, a bunch of kind of grass-eating fascists on the seaside. You can't. I made that bit up, but you can imagine the rhetoric. You can't let them decide that we can't come to Germany. And the German Interior Minister, to its credit, said, sorry, Schengen is Schengen. We are a single area, and any country that joins Schengen puts its names on the blacklist. And sorry, your guys cannot come to the Schengen area anymore. And the Russians are furious, but it seems to me you can make these EU mechanisms work, and work in a very effective way. But we are at 10% of what we ought to be doing. I just discovered to my horror that the EU pipelines coordinator has taken on a part-time job as mayor of The Hague on the grounds that pipelines isn't a full-time job. And we need to raise our game hugely. But I do think that the combination of EU competition policy and the powers in the Energy Commission are really quite substantial. We can ultimately say to Gazprom, what you're doing in the EU is illegal and you have to change. And those are pretty tough powers. I mean, if we've scared Microsoft, we can certainly scare Gazprom.
You mentioned Gazprom, and there was a question about Gazprom and how badly it is managed.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, equally, you would think that if Russia's main claim to be a member of the Security Council is its nuclear arsenal, that they would be paying great attention to the modernisation and effective management of their nuclear weapons. and you would not think that they had a strategic submarine fleet which no longer has a workable missile, because every time they test the Bulava it crashes. I think if you're optimistic, you think they are completely corrupt and completely incompetent. And in the end, all they're going to do is just steal so much money that the whole thing's going to collapse. If you're pessimistic, you think they're quite corrupt and quite incompetent, but there are bits that aren't totally corrupt and totally incompetent, and those are the bits that can do us damage. And, depending on whether I'm feeling optimistic or pessimistic, I wobble between those two. But certainly Gazprom is not going to be, in an era of gas shortage, doesn't mean that Gazprom's gas weapon becomes any less. They will be able to say, sorry guys, there isn't enough gas to go round, please form an orderly queue, and the Germans are going to be at the front. And tough luck, those of you which have tried to pursue an independent energy policy. So I think they can use the era of gas shortage quite effectively.
Who is doing the audits for Gazprom? Okay. Any more questions? We have a couple of minutes left. Gentleman at the back, please. One here.
Well, in relation of Central Asia and Caspian gas for Europe, so the Gazprom was focusing on kind of a multi-focus approach to destroy this link whenever possible. In late 90s, Trans-Caspian didn't happen partially in a big deal because of the Blue Stream and so on. Now, suddenly we learned that Bulgaria and Greece jumped on the South Stream as if they've been negotiating for many, many months without giving any information either to Brussels or to their NATO allies and so on. So this is the reflection that there was a carefully designed strategy with all these different countries. Now we know that Georgia is a country, if this country gets under the influence and there is no link with the Caspian, this country cannot be diversified in a way. So what is the Russia's strategy in relation with this country? It is clear that Georgians cannot be taken by force. As far as there is a democracy in Georgia, they will never vote that Russia should be directing Georgia's strategy. Right. So what Russia is thinking about this? Well, that's one question, and another one, please.
Well, I think we're running out of time, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
But should we take one more question, then I'll wind up? There's one final question.
Yeah, there's a lady here.
This lady here has had a hand up since the beginning.
In one way or another.
Okay.
But I do have a question that follows up on the one that was just asked, which is a little more specific. He asked what Russia is thinking, and I'd like to ask you, do you have any idea what it is that drives Putin?
Right.
What is his goal?
Okay, and before you start answering, there's a lady who's been trying to ask the question for a long time. This will be the last one from this end. Oops.
I wanted to defend your use of the term the New Cold War. But from a rather different point of view, that what I do find, I take, you argue, I think, very cogently in your book that it's not the old Cold War, it's a new situation. But what is like the old Cold War is that we find you writing a book which is highly critical of the Russian system. Richard Sackler is giving a much more positive one. In other words, there already is a whole discourse happening which is very reminiscent of the old Cold War. You remember the LSE meeting on the media?
Yes.
We had it there because we had representatives from Russia, the young ones, who were actually making Putin into a hero. So we're back in talking in the same terms. Now what I want to ask you is, what do you think makes a difference in outcomes? Because I don't think that the discourse that happened in the old Cold War of pro and anti, very critical, not critical, nationalism or what have you, I don't think that made any difference to the outcome, to the end of the Soviet Union.
Well, I think, I think we have to keep our end up, basically, and if we're attacked, we should defend ourselves. I don't think we're any more in a position where we can preach to Russia. I think we've lost any kind of credibility or moral authority that we had on a large scale to do that. And so, but I am in favour of just whenever we get the chance to confront people from the Kremlin or from associated news agencies that are perhaps financed by the Kremlin. I think we just have to go in and bash them, and that's what I do. And to some extent, the book's part of that, because to some extent they want their arguments to go by default. They think if they carry on with their line again and again and again and again and again, people will start believing it. And I just want to point out that, that it's not true. I think on Georgia, I would like to say that Georgia is run by wise people who think very deeply before they make decisions, take advice from a large circle of expert advisors, also consult with the outside world, and then, almost always get it right. I don't think I can say that with quite as much confidence as I would like, and I suspect that one of the Russian strategies is to provoke your president, the Georgian president, in the hope that he does something stupid. And we saw that with the, I think with the November events, we saw that with the GRU officers who got arrested. We may begin to see it again with the lifting of the arms embargo in Abkhazia. And so I think that's really worrying, and it's one of the big problems with Georgia not getting MAP, is that the West lacks some kind of institutional constraints for perhaps reining back President Saakashvili, who, although he's wonderful in many ways, does have a tendency to be perhaps what one might politely call impetuous. And finally, the excellent question from Magda. As I said, when I'm being optimistic, I think that it's just money in the end. It's stealing. It's just money. When I'm being optimistic, I think it's just stealing tens of billions of dollars. And this whole sort of flim-flam about sovereign democracy and Third Rome and all the rest of it is really just a con, to camouflage, a maskirovka, to enable this enormous theft. And when they no longer need it, they'll turn that off and they'll pretend to be much more civilized and emollient and calm in order then to be able to shovel this money out to the West. And that may be what Medvedev is about, and that's sort of worrying in one way. And when I'm feeling more pessimistic, I think they really believe it, and they're driven by revenge, or revanchism. They want to get back the sort of power they had inside the system in the old days, and they pretty much regained that, the power to splat their opponents, literally. And they want to get back influence in the countries that they think are historically part of Russia's, and they want to neutralise us. And, and I would say so far they're doing a pretty good job doing that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think on this soft and optimistic note, we should probably finish our session. And if I could suggest a round of applause for Ed Lucas. Thanks very much. And the book is here. Yes. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.